Monday morning, 7:30. I accidentally saw a message on my wife's phone. By Monday night, I was convinced she was cheating. By Wednesday, I thought she'd already decided to leave me. I had exactly 3 days before Saturday. 3 days to decide whether to confront her or quietly pack a suitcase and walk away from 22 years of marriage. Because after Saturday, I believed my marriage would already be over. The strange part, I wasn't looking for proof. I was looking for the weather, her. Phone was on the kitchen counter. Screen still lit. I picked it up out of habit. 22 years of marriage will do that. The weather app wasn't open. A message thread was. One sentence stopped me cold. He can never know who he really is until Saturday. I read it 3 times. Who he really is? My name is Daniel. I'm a high school janitor. I've mopped the same hallways for 11 years. I am, by every measure I know, an ordinary man. Emma never seemed to think so. She used to say I deserved more credit than I gave myself. I never understood what she meant by that. Not until Saturday. More messages came in that afternoon. Same unknown number. He asked another question today. He still thinks he's ordinary. If he discovers it now, he'll refuse. Refuse what? I didn't know. I set the phone down exactly where I found it and went to work like nothing had happened. I mopped the same 3 hallways I always mop. I said good morning to the same people. And the entire time, that sentence sat in my chest like a stone I'd swallowed. That night, Emma came home from her shift and kissed me hello like she did every night. Asked about my day like she did every night. I asked about hers. She said it. Was quiet. I said mine was too. Neither of us was telling the truth. I lay awake next to her, listening to her breathe, and I felt like I was lying next to a stranger wearing my wife's face. I hated how easily my mind went to the worst version of things. I hated it, and I couldn't stop it. By midnight, I'd made a decision. I was going to follow her. I told myself I'd feel foolish by morning. I was wrong about that, too. Tuesday afternoon, Emma left the house at exactly 2:15. She'd started doing that twice a week now, always the same time, always without saying where. I gave her a 2-minute head start and followed. She drove to an old courthouse downtown. I parked across the street. I wish I hadn't followed her, because what I saw there became the first piece of evidence that almost destroyed my marriage. A man in a sharp gray suit met her on the steps. He hugged her. Long enough that I stopped breathing. He handed her a sealed envelope. She wiped her eyes. Then the wind carried one sentence across the street. He deserves to know. Not yet. I sat in that car a long time after they both went back inside. 22 years, and suddenly I was a stranger reading a scene I didn't have the script for. That evening, I asked her how her shift went. She said it was quiet, said she'd spent it at the hospital. I found out later that wasn't true. She hadn't been at the hospital at all. She'd been 3 towns over in a stranger's kitchen, trying to get a retired firefighter to talk about the worst night of his life. He'd said no twice before she showed up at his door herself. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was my wife had lied to my face, and something in me cracked that never fully closed again. I almost said something that night. I didn't. Instead, before I left for work the next morning, Emma handed me a cup of coffee, the way she'd done 1,000 mornings before. She kissed my forehead, said, "Drive safely." She smiled. Exactly the same smile she'd given me every morning for 22 years. That almost made it worse. I stood in the driveway holding that coffee, watching her wave from the doorway, and thought, how can someone lie to my face and still be this kind to me? I didn't have an answer. I just had a wall in the hallway that looked different when I got home. There was an empty nail, a pale rectangle on the wall, one photograph, gone. I walked closer. Out of every picture in our house, She'd taken only one, our wedding day. I no longer thought she was cheating. I thought she'd already decided to leave. Then I found the drawer, never locked before. Locked now. I told myself I wouldn't open it. I lasted 27 minutes. The key wasn't in any of the obvious places. It took me most of the afternoon to find it, taped beneath a shelf in her closet like she'd hidden it from a version of me. She already expected to come looking. I opened the drawer, a folder. On the tab, in Emma's handwriting, Daniel Carter, Documentary Research Notes. The folder had my name on it. I almost put it back. I should have. I opened it with my hands shaking. The first page made no sense. A photograph of a building I'd never seen. A date circled in red. The second page frightened me. A witness statement signed and dated describing a night I had no memory of. The third page had my name on it, typed at the top of a form like I was the subject of an investigation. By the fourth page, I thought my life was over. Fingerprint cards, interview transcripts with names I didn't recognize, military records, my own wedding photo tucked inside a plastic sleeve like evidence. I flipped through every page looking for an explanation. I found more questions instead. There were names of people I hadn't spoken to in 20 years, a neighbor from a house we'd moved out of when I was 7. Someone had gone looking for them. Someone had asked them questions about me. For one night, my mind went somewhere dark. I looked at those fingerprint cards and thought about every mistake I'd ever made. Wondered if she'd found one I didn't even remember making. I barely slept. I found nothing. Because there was nothing to find. I just didn't know that yet. Wednesday night, I drove to my sister's house, still holding the memory of that folder like it might dissolve if I stopped thinking about it. I asked her point blank if there was something about our family she'd never told me. Her face changed. She went quiet in a way I'd never seen. She wouldn't answer. Just kept saying, "If Emma's involved, trust her," like it was the only sentence she was allowed to use. That told me everyone knew something, except me. I started to wonder how long this had been going on. Weeks? Months? I had no idea I was already the last person in my own life to find out. That same week, the man in the gray suit kept appearing. Once at the cemetery, near my mother's grave, writing something in a small notebook. Once outside my own school. Then, at Wednesday night service, 3 rows behind me in church, a place he had no reason to be. My sister told me later he'd sat with her one afternoon, going through old yearbooks from my high school, pointing at names, courthouse, cemetery, my school, my church, my sister's living room, my own childhood in photographs. Why does this man know every place that has ever mattered to me? I even checked if he'd been at our wedding 22 years ago. I couldn't find him in a single photo. That didn't make me feel better. Then he stopped appearing entirely. For the rest of the week, nothing. That silence scared me more than seeing him ever had. Saturday came slower than any day of my life. Emma told me to get dressed, told me we had somewhere to be. I stood in front of the mirror longer than I needed to, straightening a collar that didn't need straightening because I wasn't ready for whatever came next. The drive was quiet. I kept waiting for her to speak first. She didn't. I remember thinking that if she said the word divorce right there in the car, I wasn't going to argue. I was too tired to fight anymore. She drove me to a restored old theater downtown, lit up for the first time in decades. I hadn't even known it was still standing. Hundreds of people filled the seats, firefighters in pressed jackets, doctors and nurses still in their scrubs, like they'd come straight from a shift, a reporter with a notepad, my sister sitting near the front, my own co-workers out of their work clothes, looking strange to me in anything but uniforms. And near the front, the man in the gray suit, standing quietly, watching the room fill up. I scanned every face, looking for the one that would explain all of this. I found nothing but strangers who already seemed to know exactly why they were there. Emma led me to 2 seats near the front and sat down beside me. She took my hand, held it the way she used. To hold it early in our marriage before either of us got comfortable enough to stop noticing. For the first time in 3 days, she looked calm, like she'd finally set down something heavy she'd been carrying alone for months. I still thought this was an ending. The lights dimmed. A documentary began to play. The first face on the screen was mine. Months earlier, cleaning out my late mother's attic. Emma had found a box of letters that didn't make sense to her at first. Old military correspondence. A name she didn't recognize mentioned once in a letter my mother never sent. She pulled the thread quietly because what she suspected was too enormous to bring to me until she was certain. Then one sentence appeared on the screen. The man Daniel Carter believed was his father. I stopped breathing. Wasn't. I looked at Emma. She wasn't looking at me. She was watching the screen, waiting for me to catch up to the life she'd spent months rebuilding. I couldn't even hear the narrator anymore. All I could hear was every terrible thing I'd believed about her. My real father was a firefighter. Decades earlier, when I was still an infant, he ran into a burning apartment building, pulled child after child out of the smoke, until there was no time left to save himself. He died a hero. He never knew he had an infant son. My mother, buried. That truth so deep it took a fire of her own to bring it back into the light. But suspicion wasn't proof. Emma needed proof. The DNA report, the one piece of paper that finally confirmed it, hadn't come back from the lab until 3 weeks before Saturday. Emma told me later she sat with those results in a hospital parking lot for almost an hour before she could make herself drive home. She still hadn't told a single soul the results. Not until every document was verified, every witness confirmed, every fact checked twice. The man in the gray suit wasn't a lover. He wasn't a lawyer building a case for divorce. He was a private investigator, hired to track down every surviving witness from that night. The courthouse, the cemetery, my school, my church, my sister's living room, my own yearbooks. All of it was Emma's search, radiating outward through my life, collecting the people who could confirm the truth before she ever brought it to me. And to pay for all of it, she sold her mother's jewelry, piece by piece, the same rings she used to say she'd pass down to a daughter we never had. She took every overtime shift the hospital would give her, coming home some nights too exhausted to speak. I'd assumed the hospital was just short-staffed. She spent nearly our entire savings and never told me. Not because she didn't trust me, because she was terrified I'd stop her before she finished. I thought about every night I'd complained, quietly, in my own head, wondering where she kept disappearing to. Every night I'd felt sorry for myself instead of asking her one honest question. She'd been carrying all of this alone, on purpose, for me. After the film ended, before anyone took the stage, Emma turned to me in the dark. I almost gave up, she said. Why? I asked. Every lead ended in another dead end, she said. Records that didn't exist anymore, people who'd moved or passed or didn't want to talk. But I kept thinking, if someone loved me enough to search this hard for my father, I'd want them to keep going. So I kept going. Then a man I recognized walked onto the stage, not a stranger from the film. My old co-worker, a history teacher, 11 years past his classroom door every single afternoon. I hadn't known he'd spent 4 months helping Emma organize tonight, calling in favors, tracking down half the firefighters in the room. He took the microphone and looked out at me. You don't know this, he said, but your wife called me back in March, and I've been helping her ever since. He paused. For 11 years, you've apologized every time you interrupted one of my classes with that mop bucket. Every single time. Like you were in the way. I always wanted to tell you something and never did. The students noticed when the floors were clean. So did I. He smiled. Tonight I finally understood why you never thought a small job was beneath you. You come from someone who felt exactly the same way, right up until the biggest night of his life. Then the captain walked slowly onto the stage, 90 years old. He looked at me for a long moment. "I couldn't save your father," he said. "But today, I finally got to meet his son." The theater went silent. Then he placed his own service medal into my hand. "Your father earned this," he said. "Your family deserves to keep it." I looked down at that medal and understood finally, all at once, everything the last 3 days had actually been. Not an affair, not a divorce, not a crime I'd forgotten. A gift I never knew I was allowed to receive. I turned to Emma. I was wrong when I thought she was cheating. Wrong when I thought she was leaving. Wrong when I thought she was building a case against me. Wrong when I thought my own family was lying to me. Wrong when I thought a stranger in a gray suit wanted to destroy my life. For 3 days, I believed every fear in my head. Not one word my wife had ever spoken. I whispered the only thing I could manage. "I'm sorry." She smiled through tears. "You never stopped loving me. You just stopped trusting yourself. I thought I had uncovered my wife's secret life. Instead, she uncovered mine. If this story reminded you of someone who has quietly loved you, don't wait 3 days to tell them. I almost did.